A boy with nothing. A billionaire with everything to lose. One warning that changes everything. Don't eat that. But what secret lies behind his words? Watch till the end to uncover a twist that no one saw coming. It was a chilly evening, and 12-year-old Jamie sat shivering on the sidewalk, his thin jacket doing little to keep out the cold. People hurried past him, paying no attention to the boy huddled against the building's wall. Jamie didn't mind. He was used to being ignored. Still, he watched the world around him with sharp eyes, noticing details that others missed. His life on the streets had made him observant, a quiet watcher of people and places. Today, however, Jamie saw something unusual. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb and out stepped Mr. Harrow, the billionaire whose face he had seen on billboards and news articles. Jamie recognized him immediately. It was hard to miss someone as important as Mr. Harrow. He was dressed in a crisp, dark suit, looking powerful but tired, his face shadowed by what seemed to be worry or maybe frustration. Jamie watched as Mr. Harrow strolled toward the cafe on the corner, his shoulders slumped. Moments later, another figure emerged from the car, a tall, graceful woman Jamie had also seen many times. It was Mrs. Harrow, Mr. Harrow's wife, always dressed elegantly and carrying herself like a queen. She wore a cold, distant expression as she glanced around before following her husband into the cafe, holding a small brown bag in her hands. Jamie squinted, watching her closely. He'd seen her many times before, usually talking on her phone in whispers or looking around suspiciously. Something about her had always seemed off to Jamie, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As he watched, Jamie saw Mrs. Harrow hand her husband a sandwich from the bag, her smile tight and almost forced. She leaned close, whispering something to him with a glint in her eye that made Jamie's skin prickle. He couldn't hear what she was saying, but something about her expression gave him an uneasy feeling. Jamie felt his heart pound faster as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Why did she look so smug? Then he heard her say, just loud enough to catch, "Everything's prepared. Soon things will be different." She looked around quickly, her gaze almost brushing over Jamie, who froze and tried to look as small as possible. Mrs. Harrow turned back to her husband, urging him to take a bite. That's when Jamie's gut screamed at him. He didn't know why, but something inside him shouted that Mr. Harrow was in danger, and he couldn't just stay silent. With all the courage he could muster, Jamie leaped up and ran toward the cafe door, bursting through just as Mr. Harrow was about to take a bite. "Don't eat that," Jamie shouted, his voice filled with urgency and fear. "Your wife put something in it." The cafe fell silent. Every eye turned toward the scrappy boy in the doorway, staring at him as if he were crazy. Mr. Harrow looked stunned, lowering the sandwich slowly, his eyes fixed on Jamie with a mix of shock and confusion. Mrs. Harrow's face tightened, her expression turning icy and dangerous. "Excuse me?" she said in a voice that was calm but sharp, her eyes narrowing at Jamie. She gave a small, dismissive laugh, glancing around as if to reassure the others. "This boy is just confused. Let's not make a scene," she said sweetly, reaching into her purse and pulling out a few crumpled bills. She held the money out to Jamie, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Here, dear, take this and buy yourself something nice." But Jamie didn't budge. He shook his head, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not lying," he insisted, his voice trembling but firm. "I've seen you before. You're always talking on the phone about things, and you just told him everything's ready. I know you're planning something bad." Mrs. Harrow's smile faded, and for a moment, a shadow of worry crossed her face. But she quickly composed herself, her voice dripping with disdain. "This boy is a troublemaker," she said, looking pointedly at her husband. "He's just looking for attention." Mr. Harrow hesitated, glancing between his wife and Jamie. Something about Jamie's fear struck him as genuine, and he found himself filled with a strange sense of doubt. He turned to Jamie, his voice quiet but kind. "Why would you say this? Do you have any proof?" Jamie swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on him. "I don't have proof, just what I've seen and heard. But please, don't eat it," he pleaded, his voice thick with worry. Just be careful." Mr. Harrow looked at Jamie for a long moment, something shifting in his eyes. Then he glanced at his wife, whose expression had turned tense and watchful. Slowly, he wrapped the sandwich back in the napkin and set it aside, his voice calm as he said, "I'll save it for later." Jamie let out a shaky breath, relieved that Mr. Harrow was taking his warning seriously, at least for now. Mrs. Harrow's eyes were cold, her smile tight, but she said nothing more. She turned her gaze back to Jamie, her eyes flashing with an unspoken threat, as if warning him to stay silent. The next morning, Mr. Harrow sat alone in his study, the untouched sandwich resting on his desk. He couldn't shake the memory of Jamie's warning, and as he stared at the neatly wrapped food, a sense of dread settled over him. Was it possible that his wife, the woman he had trusted for years, would ever harm him? But Jamie's frightened face haunted him, and he decided to take no chances. He made a call to a nearby laboratory, arranging for the sandwich to be tested in secret. He carefully packed it into a small container and had his driver discreetly drop it off. Hours later, the results arrived, and as Mr. Harrow read the report, a chill ran down his spine. The lab had found traces of a toxic substance, something that could slowly make someone sick, or even lead to something far worse. Jamie had been right. His wife had tried to poison him. Shaken and filled with a deep, painful betrayal, Mr. Harrow realized that he owed everything to the brave boy who had stepped forward to save his life. Without Jamie's courage, he might never have known the truth. Determined to find him, Mr. Harrow returned to the cafe street, searching through the crowd and asking passersby if they'd seen a boy matching Jamie's description. Finally, after nearly an hour, he spotted Jamie huddled against the wall in his usual spot, clutching his thin jacket to keep warm. When Jamie saw Mr. Harrow approaching, he looked wary, uncertain of what to expect. But as Mr. Harrow knelt beside him, there was no anger or suspicion in his gaze, only gratitude. "Jamie," he began softly, "I need to thank you. You saved my life." Jamie blinked, surprised, not used to hearing such kind words. He shifted nervously, but Mr. Harrow continued, "You were right. The sandwich was poisoned. I don't know how you knew, but I want to hear everything." Jamie looked down, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. "I see things," he said quietly. "People don't notice me, but I watch them. I've seen her, your wife. She comes here a lot, always talking in whispers, looking around like she's hiding something. I overheard her once saying that things would be better without you. I didn't know what she meant until last night." Mr. Harrow listened intently, a deep sadness settling in his heart as he realized how blind he had been. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on Jamie's shoulder. "Thank you for trusting me, Jamie," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I owe you so much. But tell me, why were you watching her so closely? Why did you care enough to warn me?" Jamie hesitated, his gaze drifting to the ground. "Because she hurt my family," he finally admitted. "My dad used to work for you. He trusted her and lost everything because of her tricks. My dad couldn't handle it, and he left us. It's just me now, trying to get by." His voice wavered, and he took a shaky breath. "I couldn't just stand by and watch her hurt someone else." Mr. Harrow's heart broke as he listened, realizing that Jamie's life had been torn apart by his own wife's actions. He saw the pain in Jamie's eyes, the weight of betrayal that had forced this young boy to grow up far too quickly. Mr. Harrow sat beside Jamie on the cold pavement, feeling the weight of the boy's story sink in. He looked at Jamie with both sadness and admiration. Here was a boy who, despite everything he had lost, had chosen to step forward to save a stranger. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Harrow made a decision. "Jamie, you deserve so much more than this life you've been forced to live," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to help you, if you'll let me." Jamie stared up at him, uncertain and a little afraid to hope. "Help me?" he asked, his voice small. "What do you mean?" "I mean giving you a fresh start," Mr. Harrow said, smiling gently. "A safe place to live, a chance to go to school, a way to turn things around. I owe you my life, Jamie. The least I can do is make sure yours is filled with opportunities, not struggles." Jamie's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away, unused to feeling seen and cared for. He had grown used to being overlooked and dismissed, to surviving on his own. The idea that someone would offer him kindness, let alone a second chance, felt almost too good to be true. But he looked at Mr. Harrow and saw only sincerity in his eyes. "Thank you," Jamie whispered, his voice trembling. I don't know what to say. I never thought." His voice trailed off, overwhelmed by the moment. In the days that followed, Mr. Harrow kept his promise. He arranged for Jamie to stay in a safe, warm home with people who treated him with kindness and respect. Jamie was enrolled in school, given clothes, and provided with all the things he had once only dreamed of. For the first time in a long while, he felt safe. He felt like he had a future. And each day he was reminded of Mr. Harrow's kindness and the bond that had brought them together. But Mr. Harrow didn't stop there. He launched a full investigation into his wife's wrongdoings, determined to uncover every deceit she had hidden from him. Through the process, he uncovered many secrets that had caused pain to other families, just like Jamie's. Using his resources and influence, he began to make amends, reaching out to help those who had been affected and setting things right. Jamie, now surrounded by care and support, grew stronger and more confident with each passing day. And though he never would have guessed it, he found himself thinking of Mr. Harrow's family, a true friend who had looked past his poverty and seen him for who he really was. Months later, as they sat together watching a sunset from Mr. Harrow's balcony, Jamie looked up at him and said, "Thank you, Mr. Harrow, for everything." Mr. Harrow placed a gentle hand on Jamie's shoulder, smiling with warmth. "No, Jamie, thank you for saving me and helping me find what truly matters. I couldn't have done it without you." And as they watched the sun, both of them knew they had found something they thought they'd lost forever, a place to belong and the beginning of a new life together.